Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Clínica ISPA. It's great to have you all with us. My name is Daniel Souza, and I'm going to be your host today. We are going to talk about the psychology of pandemics, and more specifically on the psychology of pandemic COVID-19. We are delighted to be joined by Dr. Stephen Taylor. Dr. Taylor is a clinical psychologist and a professor in the Department of Psychiatry in the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, Canada. His research and clinical works have focused largely on anxiety disorders and related clinical issues, including fears and post-traumatic stress disorder. He's the author of 300 scientific publications and more than 20 books. Dr. Taylor wrote an amazing book, I should say, published in October 2019 called The Psychology of Pandemics, just before COVID-19 started. After a presentation by Dr. Taylor, we are going to have some time to make questions. I will ask you then people to raise your hand using Zoom for those who want to make some questions. And so with no further delay, I will pass on you, Stephen. Welcome, Stephen, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for inviting me to present to you today. I'm going to try and share this screen.
All right.
See how this goes. Can everyone see the PowerPoint screen?
Yes.
Great. Just 1 second. Okay, so yes, we're talking about the psychology of pandemics, including some research that we've been doing on the psychology of COVID-19. I guess we were fortunate in a way when this pandemic erupted early 2020 and many research labs across the world had to shut down. Ours was up and running and we were collecting internet-based data on people trying to understand the psychology of COVID-19. Just as a bit of background, as Daniel mentioned, in 2019, I published a book called The Psychology of Pandemics, and people often ask me the backstory of this. Why did I write this book? So I just thought I'd spend a minute or so talking about that. I started working on this book in 2017, late 2017, which was close to the centenary of the so-called Spanish flu pandemic. And around about that time, there were a lot of media interviews with virologists and other disease experts, and they were all talking about the next pandemic. They were saying another pandemic is inevitable, it will be coming soon. So I got interested in that, and the more I looked into it, the more I realized that psychology is hugely important in pandemics, which I'll talk about a bit later on, and no one had ever put it together into a single book. So I knew a pandemic was coming, but I didn't realize it was coming so soon. So I was taken by surprise by that. So today, what I'd like to talk about is the importance of psychological factors and why psychology is so hugely important in pandemics. I want to talk about the similarities between COVID-19 and past pandemics. There are some differences, but there are a huge number of similarities. Some noteworthy differences. And I'll talk about some recent advances in the psychology of pandemics. I mean, there's been a lot of new research in the past 13 months relevant to this. Talk a bit about mental health resources and finish up with some speculations about life in a post-pandemic world. Notice I say post-pandemic, I don't say post-COVID, because unlike SARS, which just disappeared from the human population, COVID might be here to stay. It might become a seasonal or episodic outbreak. But the pandemic will come to an end, I assure you of that. So psychology is hugely important because the methods for managing pandemics involve people agreeing to do things. So the communication from health authorities needs to be clear, consistent, and trustworthy. If you don't trust what the health authorities are saying to you, you're not going to follow their advice. People have to agree to give up small freedoms. People have to agree to wear masks, to wash their hands, to cover their coughs, to engage in social distancing. They have to agree to get vaccinated. If people don't agree to any of these things, it's impossible to manage a pandemic. So attitudes and behaviors are hugely important. And of course, as you all know, during this pandemic, there's been an increase in psychopathology, a rise of psychological disorders, and a worsening of pre-existing psychological problems. So either triggered by the pandemic or worsening of pre-existing conditions. There are all kinds of stresses associated with pandemics. I think one of the major ones which many people fail to recognize is uncertainties. Uncertainties is an abstract stressor. There's all kinds of uncertainties. And there's been uncertainty since the very beginning. So uncertainty as to how bad it will be, what the optimal method of management or treatment might be, uncertainty as to what we should do to keep ourselves safe, and so forth. Obviously, illness and death are stresses, socioeconomic costs are stresses, and in fact, many people are impacted mostly by the socioeconomic costs of the pandemic rather than personal illness or illness or death of loved ones. Disruptions of work or school, and those of you who have young children know how difficult and challenging it can be to take care of young children and work from home during lockdown. The stresses of self-isolation or quarantine, uncertainty of who is infected, especially given that people can be asymptomatic carriers, and uncertainty as to whether it's over. I guess late last year, as the first wave ended, many of us were just waiting for the second wave, but many people in the community thought it was done. They thought it was over. And so they were getting out and partying. And of course, when they were getting out and partying, they were reinfecting one another, and the second wave arose. And that was very frustrating to people. But so there's that big uncertainty. How many waves will there be? Hopefully just 2 or 3 waves or fewer. And of course, a stressor that many people fail to recognize is the disruption in social rituals. For example, we're seeing now live stream funerals, where funerals will be done virtually rather than in person. And we're finding that some of the people who are not taking this pandemic seriously, or who are neglecting to engage in social distancing, who are having parties, some of them are people saying it's not fair that their rituals have been suspended. For example, students who are no longer able to have parties at the beginning of the academic year are going out and having surreptitious or secret parties because they feel that this is an important ritual for them. So the loss of rituals is an important stressor during pandemics. The psychological footprint of a pandemic is bigger than the medical footprint. And this is what I mean by this. Yes, indeed, pandemics are serious. And during COVID-19, many people have become sick and died and have developed so-called long COVID or chronic problems after getting infected. So that's true, and no one's denying that. However, many more people are impacted psychologically than they are medically. To give you an example of this, back in April, when we were collecting our first wave of data collection, we collected data on nearly 6,000 adults from Canada and the United States. We found that about 20 to 25% were experiencing clinically significant psychological problems, anxiety or depression, 20 to 25%. Only 2% had ever been infected with the coronavirus. So that's what I mean when the psychological footprint is bigger than the medical footprint. And so you can get anticipatory anxiety ahead of actual infection. And this was seen quite dramatically during the Ebola outbreak in 2007 in West Africa. There had been only 1 or 2 cases of Ebola in the United States, but many people were frightened of Ebola. I remember traveling through the United States in December 2019, and I was connecting through Miami airport, and there were big TV screens warning people about Ebola. And I'm standing there looking at this thinking, well, why aren't they warning people about seasonal flu, which will kill more people than Ebola in the United States? But this is what I mean by this anticipatory anxiety. Health anxiety, that is excessive anxiety about one's health, post-traumatic stress disorder and other stress-related syndromes, bereavement, depression, and so forth. Underreactions are also an important problem during this pandemic and past pandemics, and that is the people who don't take it seriously, who think that COVID-19 is a hoax, or believe it's not necessary for them to engage in social distancing, or believe that they don't need to wear masks. Those underreactions are just as important as the excessive psychological reactions. Pandemics are dynamic events. And this is something that many researchers don't understand. They collect their data at one point in time, let's say, halfway through the first wave of the pandemic, and then try and generalize their findings throughout the entire pandemic. That's something you shouldn't do because things change over time. This is data from a public opinion poll in Canada last year, and it charts the percentage of people who are worried about getting COVID-19. And here you can see that from February up to April, the numbers increase. People are getting more and more worried. And this parallels the actual prevalence of infection in the community. As the rates of infection went down towards June, people started to worry less. Unfortunately, they also started to socialize more and the rates of infection went up and the anxiety levels went up as well. Currently, in many places throughout the world today, people are in a state of not so much high anxiety, but more a state of pandemic fatigue or a kind of burnout, emotional exhaustion from having endured so many rolling lockdowns. I want to talk about that a little later on. Risk communication. Risk communication is the messages that the health authorities or the government send out to the population. And that message has to do with how dangerous the infection is and what you should do to stay safe. And if you don't trust the health authorities, you're not going to follow their advice. And I just want to give you an example of this. Getting back to Ebola outbreak in around about 2007, there was a study done in Liberia, and at the time they were in lockdown. The people who were refusing to go into lockdown, who were violating social distancing, were the people who didn't trust the messages they were getting from the government. So there we're talking about Ebola. So you can understand how important it is that the population receive these messages as being transparent, trustworthy, and accurate. And here's a newspaper clipping from 1918. You can see the highlighted section there that says, "The health authorities claim there is no danger of a serious epidemic." And this was at the very beginning of the Spanish flu. And you can see here how the message was wrong. And when health authorities give out wrong messages, it creates anxiety, uncertainty, and people start to distrust the government. And we've seen the same during COVID-19. And here's President Bolsonaro from Brazil, who was understating the pandemic, say, oh, it's just like a little flu, nothing to worry about. See, that undermines public confidence when your message is incorrect. So comparing COVID-19 to previous pandemics in a little more detail, there are a lot of similarities. The surge of anticipatory anxiety, the rise of racism and xenophobia, panic buying, both hospital surge, that is the worried well rushing into hospital thinking they're infected when in fact they're not, but also the avoidance of hospitals and the fear and avoidance of healthcare workers for fear of getting infected. Sporadic looting and rioting, but more commonly a rise of altruism as people come together to help one another. Rumors and conspiracy theories. Interestingly, the conspiracy theories we're seeing around COVID-19 are simply, by and large, recycled conspiracy theories from previous pandemics. The idea that it's a bioweapon or that some shadowy government agency is behind all of this, that it was created in a lab, that they're not new. They were seen in the Zika virus pandemic in 2006. And also during SARS in 2003. Mask rebellion, the refusal to wear masks is not new. It was seen in the Spanish flu pandemic, which I'll talk about in a second. And of course, vaccination refusal or hesitancy. Nothing new there. So I want to just look at these phenomena in a little more detail. Really, the take-home message is everything old is new again, but there's just simply more of it and things are going faster. So really, the similarities are quite striking between COVID-19 and past pandemics. There were quack cures or folk remedies in 1918, Spanish flu. The idea of eating onions kept you safe. 2020, people were talking about gargling water infused with garlic as a way of keeping safe. Neither of them work, of course. Quack cures, 1918, Dr. Mackenzie's smelling bottle. And in 2020, there are so many quack cures out there that the FDA has put up a website where you can go and search for these quack cures. And the FDA, that's the US Food and Drug Administration, are trying to crack down on this. There are just so many of these bogus products out there. Desperate measures. In 1918, people were drinking hydrogen peroxide. Their reasoning was, oh, well, if it kills germs, then if I drink it, it will kill the flu. Of course, don't drink hydrogen peroxide, it will kill you. Of course, in 2020, the same thing. People were drinking hand sanitizer and dying from that. Profiteering, In 1918, unscrupulous vendors were trying to make a dollar, trying to sell their products. Same in 2020. Selling Scotch, a real tonic for the flu in 1918. This is a sign in Times Square in New York from 2020, where the Coca-Cola company were trying to profit from the pandemic as well. Fraud and larceny. Again, this is nothing new. People trying to defraud the government during COVID-19. The same has happened in previous pandemics. In fact, there's an interesting case. In 1918, there was a woman that the newspapers called Flu Julia, and Flu Julia pretended to be a nurse, and she would go into the homes of sick people and rob them. She robbed about 50 homes before she was caught. Mask rebellion is not new. We saw it in 2020, and we're seeing it today, people refusing to wear masks. Well, in San Francisco in 1919, they attempted to mandate the wearing of masks and make it compulsory to try and contain the Spanish flu, and people rebelled. The Anti-Mask League was formed, and that was a short-lived protest group in which they were protesting against the wearing of masks. Interestingly, this group fizzled out because they didn't have social media to fuel the movement. Unlike today, where you've got these anti-mask groups in social media who are egging each other on. Interestingly, the reasons people objected to wearing masks in 1919 were the same as today. They thought they were ineffective, they felt uncomfortable, and they didn't like being forced to wear masks. That is, they thought their civil rights were being violated. And this don't like being forced is really important. It's a phenomenon called psychological reactants. And this is my son when he was 3 years old. He's now 16. He epitomized psychological reactants. This is almost like an allergic reaction to being told what to do. That's a "you're not the boss of me" kind of reaction. And people who are raised in individualistic societies where they're taught about the value of personal freedoms have this intense psychological reactance when someone tells them what to do. So if you had someone with a high level of psychological reactance and you tried to argue with them as to why they should wear a mask, two things are going to happen. They're going to get angry and they're going to think of counter arguments. So arguing with a person with a high level of psychological reactance is counterproductive. Nudges or other sorts of messaging are more tend to be more effective. Let me just. So there are various strategies for dealing with psychological reactants. This high intense psychological reactants is only a minority of people. Most people are okay with wearing masks or socially distancing, but for these high psychological reactants people, you need different sorts of messaging that can be useful. Getting creative with masks in 1918, nothing new there. It's been seen, of course, in 2020. Panic buying. In 1918, there was panic buying of all kinds of products in pharmacies, including Vicks Vapor Rub, which was a mentholated ointment that you would rub on your chest and it made breathing easier. And of course, today we're getting panic buying of toilet paper, or in Vancouver or Canada where cannabis is legal, panic buying of cannabis, or if you live in the United States, panic buying of guns and ammo. And panic buying has some snowballing effects. It usually occurs when communities are being threatened with lockdown. In 2020, 2021, this is when it occurred. So yeah, this is one way of understanding the snowballing effect. So the community is told to stock up with a 2-week supply of groceries and so forth. People flock to the stores with a common goal of stocking up. Inevitably, there is a small group, a small cohort of highly anxious people who overpurchase out of a sense of urgency and a fear of scarcity. And there's a fear contagion effect. We are social animals. We pick up cues from what's going on around us. You've heard of the stampedes in football stadiums and concerts, for example, where people are crushed through stampedes. And this is this fear contagion effect. You see everybody running, and so you start running yourself. It's the same with panic buying. And the dramatic images and videos go viral, and it increases the public's sense of threat. So really, the purchasing is driven by the behavior of other shoppers, not a threat to the supply chain. And so this fear of scarcity creates an actual short-term scarcity. And then stores step in and there are socially corrective mechanisms, and panic buying dies down until the next cycle begins. Here's a tip that I like to share with my patients and other people, that if you hear about panic buying happening, most people think to themselves, oh, I better get down to the store to get ahead of the crowd. Well, that kind of thinking will put you in the middle of the crowd because everyone is thinking the same thing. Episodes of panic buying last about 1 week. So if you can wait for 1 week, the crowds will be gone and the shelves will be restocked. So that's the best strategy for dealing with panic buying. Wait till it dies down. Altruism was seen in past pandemics, but it's a conditional form of altruism. Often there's also a fear and avoidance of healthcare workers, and that happened during the SARS outbreak. So here in Vancouver and many places throughout the world, there's the evening cheer for healthcare workers. But the same people who are cheering on the safety of their balconies are also very frightened of healthcare workers. We did a survey last year of 3,500 adults, and we found that many of these people, including the people who cheered, were terrified of healthcare workers. They had this mistaken belief that healthcare workers were carriers of COVID-19. And here's just some examples. If you look at the bottom bar, it says about a third of our respondents, none of whom were healthcare workers, thought that healthcare workers should be separated from their families. And people are more likely to be frightened of healthcare workers if they had misinformation about COVID-19 and if they were very frightened about infection. Now, being a healthcare worker is very stressful, and burnout is a problem for them at the best of times. And of course, it's even worse now. Healthcare workers don't need this additional stigmatization. Pandemic fatigue, and this is a progressive demotivation. It's a kind of burnout state. And it's associated with a progressive disregard for social distancing. People are tired of rolling lockdowns. They're emotionally exhausted. They're sick of COVID-19. They're mildly depressed and irritable, and they're not bothering to social distance. They're going out and partying or socializing. And this is what pandemic fatigue is. And this was seen in 1919 and 1918 during the Spanish flu, where people were disregarding social distancing and going to church services or other places. Incidentally, these sorts of events are super spreading events, which contributes to the increase in infection. If you're interested, there's a really nice guide to pandemic fatigue published recently by the World Health Organization, which describes it and offers some strategies for addressing the problem. Talk about conspiracy theories. One thing that's a little different about this pandemic as compared to previous ones is the prominence of conspiracy theories. There've always been conspiracy theorists out there, but usually they live in their own little silos and they don't get much media attention. Well, during COVID-19, some political leaders, particularly Donald Trump, has been espousing conspiracy theories. So they're getting a lot more attention than they normally would. These are some examples. You'll see how similar they are to the COVID conspiracy theories. During Zika, there was the theory that it was part of a plot by some fictitious organization called the New World Order, that the virus was intended to depopulate the planet so they could take charge. SARS was a bioweapon. The Spanish flu pandemic occurred during World War I. And in Britain and the United States, there were conspiracy theories that the influenza was being spread by German spies, which is not true, of course. And this is something that was published in the New York Times at the time in 1918, in which they were discussing the conspiracy theories that Germans were coming ashore in Manhattan in U-boats with containers of virus and spreading them in theaters and so forth. Again, a conspiracy theory. And it's similar today. Today we're seeing the conspiracy theory. If you live in the United States, there's a conspiracy theory which is fairly widespread, actually, that the coronavirus was created by the Chinese as a bioweapon. If you go to China, there's the conspiracy theory that the virus was created by the Americans as a bioweapon. And there's all kinds of other ones too. There's all diverse sorts of motivations for circulating conspiracy theories. And this makes COVID-19 a little different. Previously, the only people who would buy into these conspiracy theories were people who had suspicious minds. They tended to be paranoid and narcissistic and derive great satisfaction from believing that they had secret knowledge. But these days, there are conspiracy theory entrepreneurs, people who make money on, say, some of these ultra right-wing websites or programs espousing conspiracy theories. Now, they need not necessarily believe the theories, but they're making a buck out of them. Then sometimes it's tactically or politically motivated. So as a way of diverting blame. So for example, Donald Trump accusing the Chinese of releasing this virus as a way of diverting blame from the way he was mismanaging the pandemic. And of course, mischief makers. So the hardcore conspiracy theorists, if they believe in one theory, they'll tend to believe in others. So if you thought COVID-19 is a bioweapon, you're also likely to believe that Monsanto created the Zika virus, that NASA faked the moon landings, that 9/11 was an inside job, and that governments are covering up evidence of extraterrestrial contacts. So they're the hardcore conspiracy theorists. But today, during COVID-19, we're seeing other people who kind of half believe these theories, but they're not the hardcore characters. And I mentioned all of that earlier on. Very difficult to change these hardcore conspiracy theorists in their thinking. You can inoculate people, but you need to think twice before circulating messages. Interestingly, it's like trying to argue with someone who's delusional. If you try and argue with a conspiracy theorist, if you try to argue that COVID-19 is not a bioweapon, they will conclude that you are part of the conspiracy. Trolls, talk about those. This makes COVID-19 a little bit different from past pandemics. And trolls intentionally antagonize other people. And here we're talking about internet trolls, for example. They spread fake images, fake news. During SARS, there was fake news about Hong Kong being sealed off. And that was circulated on a fake website that was pretending to be a news website on the internet by a troll. The bat soup examples, you probably remember these from early 2020, the claim that this was a woman in Wuhan eating bat soup. In fact, it wasn't. It was a photograph or a pair of photographs taken years ago in Palau, which is an archipelago of islands in the Pacific. It wasn't even in China, but it was circulated by trolls to create mischief. Trolls tend to have psychopathic traits. They're callous and manipulative. They lack empathy and remorse. They enjoy hurting or humiliating people. And they have something called negative social potency. They enjoy creating mischief and mayhem. So the best strategy for managing trolls is do not feed the trolls. Don't respond to them. Don't circulate their images or so forth. Important differences. Social media is really the biggest difference between COVID-19 and past pandemics, and a 24/7 news cycle. And the infodemic. And by that, I mean just the sheer quantity of a mix of true news, misinformation, deliberately fake news. And it makes it very difficult for people to sort out what's true and what's not. In fact, in terms of the infodemic, we're seeing an infodemic of psychology research, where there's been so much research published during COVID-19 that it's hard to keep up, including a lot of junk research. We're seeing an infodemic of junk science as well. And so it can become very difficult for researchers to sort out what is a good study and what is rubbish. Some important differences. In past pandemic, there are different beliefs about the causes of disease. If you think about the Russian flu pandemic in 1889, one of the prominent beliefs was that diseases were caused by miasma, which is a kind of noxious gas or fog released at night from swamps or rivers or so forth. So it was the idea that bad air at night was the cause of disease. And so as a result of these beliefs, people weren't covering their coughs or socially distancing. They were shutting their windows at night to keep out the bad air. So beliefs about disease influence people's behaviors. We've benefited from some lessons of the past. For example, you'd never name a pandemic after people, places, or things, because that promotes discrimination or the needless culling of animals. You don't call something Wuhan flu because that promotes racism, or you don't call it bat flu because that promotes the destruction or culling of animals. What's maybe different of COVID-19 versus past pandemic are the long-term neuropsychiatric effects of being infected, the so-called long COVID, where some of these people, after they've recovered from COVID-19, develop long-term chronic health problems. And there are various kinds of health problems that have been documented, including what looks like a chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, this is a little bit different than past pandemics, but not entirely. During the Russian flu pandemic, 1889, it was initially thought that it was due to an influenza virus, but now there's a theory that it was actually a coronavirus. There was evidence of long-term psychiatric effects too, such as recurrent chronic headache. So this is not entirely different from past pandemics. I think one of the things that has been confusing people in this pandemic that's made it rather different from past pandemics is the rapidly evolving views on COVID-19. And that's due to the 24/7 news cycle and the sheer abundance of research being conducted. So you'll remember back in early 2020, the WHO were telling us all, don't wear masks. They were saying you shouldn't wear a mask, save the mask for the healthcare workers. And now a year later, the message is the complete opposite, telling people to wear masks. And this can confuse people. And it's simply due to the evolving views or research on the efficacy of face mask wearing. This is personal protective equipment circa 1650. These are plague doctors, and they would go around to homes. This is during the bubonic plague or Black Death. They would go around to homes checking on the dead. There really wasn't much they could do for the sick or the dead, except count up the numbers. But you can see here that the plague doctors had their trusty stick to poke at the patient to see if the patient was still alive. They had gloves, they had protective eyewear, glass eyewear, and this beak thing. It's not a face mask, it's a beak. And this beak was stuffed with aromatic herbs. Again, it's based on the miasma idea. They weren't wearing a face mask because they were worried about people coughing on them. They were worried about bad air. So this was hence the beak. And you can see up in the top corner, the lettering says Dr. Schnabel, which is German for beak. I'm going to talk a bit about our research, our COVID stress study. It's a longitudinal ongoing study. We're trying to identify patterns of stress and coping, vulnerability factors, sources of that non-adherence, and our ultimate goal is to develop and refine treatments, but we're still away from developing treatments. So our research was based on the assumption that most people are resilient, that most people are hardy and resilient against stress. And that's based on previous research. And this is why I keep telling people will bounce back once this pandemic is over, because most people are resilient. But we were also interested in the extremes of over-responding or excessive anxiety and the extremes of under-responding. And we're finding evidence for a COVID stress syndrome, which is an adjustment disorder that I'll talk about in a second, and something we're calling a COVID disregard syndrome. Now, it's not a syndrome in the medical sense, it's a syndrome in that it's a constellation or collection of correlated attitudes and behaviors. So this is a disregard syndrome. And these are people who think the COVID threat is exaggerated. They see themselves as being low risk for infection. They're not compliant with social distancing, and they're more likely to refuse a vaccine. Now, the media portrays these people as being young people. And it's not exclusively young people. There's just as many older individuals who are disregarding the significance. So the question is, why do some people disregard the significance of COVID-19? There are all kinds of reasons. One reason is that COVID-19 is very different from past pandemics in that it's fairly abstract. We don't see things like this. And this was San Francisco during the Spanish flu in 1918, a coffin truck. We don't see coffins in the front rooms of houses or hearses traveling the street every day, or coffin trucks. For us during COVID-19, it's very much an abstract pandemic for many people, where you encounter death or sickness through the internet news or social media. It's not in your face. And I think that could be one thing that leads people to disregard the significance of COVID-19. This is the COVID stress syndrome, and these are 5 intercorrelated traits. Now, earlier in the year, researchers were talking about COVID phobia or coronaphobia. They were talking about it as if it was just a specific phobia. That is an oversimplification. It's more complicated than that. It's not just simply a focal phobia. We're finding evidence of 5 intercorrelated factors The first is fear of getting contaminated. So that is the coronaphobia, fear of getting, but it's correlated with xenophobia, that is fear of foreigners, or fear that strangers are infected. Traumatic stress symptoms, that is nightmares and intrusive thoughts about COVID-19, often because these people are spending a lot of time watching the news media and seeing dramatic images. It's also associated with compulsive checking and reassurance seeking, and fears about the personal socioeconomic impacts. Now, we're thinking that this doesn't fit into any DSM-5 category, but we're thinking this is an adjustment disorder at the extreme end, because we're finding that the severity of the syndrome rises and falls depending on the prevalence of infection in communities. So the question that we're wondering is, will the syndrome just disappear once the pandemic is over, or will it become more chronic for some people? Will some people develop a chronic germophobia? So people with this syndrome, they, as you would guess, have a past history of psychopathology and an intolerance of uncertainty. So I mentioned uncertainty earlier on as being one of the stresses. And there's this personality trait called intolerance of uncertainty. And people who score very high on that trait tend to worry a great deal. They have a lot of trouble dealing with uncertainties in their lives. And of course, during this pandemic, they worry about COVID-19. Yeah, so I'll just skip that. This is a stupidly complicated graph. This is a network analysis of one of our research papers. We were trying to understand how all of these things fit together. And the blue ellipses are, that's the COVID stress syndrome. And the upper peach colored ellipses, that's the COVID disregard syndrome. But we were looking at how all of these things are interrelated to one another. And the green lines are positive links or positive partial correlations, and the darker and thicker the link, the stronger the association. And the red ones are negative partial correlations or negative associations. So you can see up in the top, well, for me, it's the top right-hand corner, the hand and cough hygiene was negatively related to the disregard syndrome. So people who think that COVID-19 is exaggerated, they tend not to be washing their hands or covering their coughs. But I put this up just to underscore the point that the psychology of pandemics is complicated. There are a lot of things involved, and we're just starting to understand how all of these things link to one another. During lockdown last year, you probably saw lots of reports in the news media that COVID-19 was very difficult for extroverts, for people who wanted to get out and socialize. So we decided to look at that, and we found that there was no evidence that extroversion was negatively related to distress during lockdown. The predictors of distress are how anxious you are about COVID-19, whether there were stresses in self-isolation, for example, stresses of overcrowding or financial problems or stresses of loneliness, and negative emotionality. Extroversion in our study and in some others now that have come out, we found it doesn't predict stress during lockdown. And that's probably because extroverts can socialize with other people via text messaging or social media or Zoom or things like that. So just because you're in self-isolation doesn't mean you're socially isolated. Xenophobia, it's occurred during most pandemics, unfortunately, and it's something that governments should have anticipated, and they should have taken steps to deal with it. President Trump should have been calling this the Chinese virus, because that promotes racism and xenophobia. So the question is why this xenophobia regularly arises during pandemics. During bubonic plague in the 1300s, Jewish people were targeted. During SARS, Asian people were targeted. During the Spanish flu, it was Germans that were targeted as targets of racism or xenophobia. There's this concept called the behavioral immune system that complements the biological immune system. It's this idea that our biological immune system isn't enough to keep us away from pathogens. So we've developed an evolved behavioral immune system where we detect cues to sickness or infection. And that triggers the emotion of disgust, which causes us to avoid. So the sight of rotting meat or saliva or fecal matter, that will trigger disgust and cause us to avoid those things. But this system is subject to false alarms. And so the idea is we have become, although we're tribalistic in nature as humans, and we live in smallish social groups, we are also xenophobic as humans. We've evolved to be xenophobic because that has kept us safe. Because historically, diseases for which we have no pre-existing immunity were brought in by foreigners. And you can see in this diagram, this image shows early European explorers coming to the Americas. The Europeans brought diseases for which the indigenous people had no pre-existing immunity, things like smallpox and influenza, which decimated indigenous peoples. So it's the idea that we have a built-in evolved system to be wary of strangers. But if you're very frightened of infection, you're going to have that extreme xenophobia. So that raises the question, we could treat prejudice perhaps by treating anxiety about COVID-19. I'm running short on time. Vaccination hesitancy is a problem. One of the big issues is the vaccine production programs have been called things like Operation Warp Speed, which is really the wrong thing to be calling a vaccine production program because it makes people anxious that the vaccine has been rushed. But that problem, I think, is going to take care of itself. There are many people who are reluctant to get vaccinated because they're worried about what the effects will be. And those people probably will get vaccinated once they see that everyone else is getting vaccinated without ill effects. In the minutes remaining, talk about mental health services and some other things. Unfortunately, the approaches have been reactive instead of proactive. We've waited for problems to emerge instead of saying, hey, this is going to be a big deal. We need to do something about it. We should have been doing something about the mental health services in March of last year, because we knew that there would be a large number of anxious people out there. And of course, as you know, there's been a rise of digital mental health services. It's not clear whether they're sufficient for severe mental health problems. Our website, we have a page which we have links to what we think are some of the better phone-based apps, such as phone-based cognitive behavior therapy or websites for cognitive behavior therapy for helping people digitally during this pandemic. And that's just another example of one, which I'll skip. Okay, in the minutes remaining, I want to wrap up by talking a bit about what life will be like in a post-pandemic world. Are we going to go from this to this? Yeah, of course we are. People have difficulty imagining going to this, but it will happen. It happened during the Spanish flu. It went from this to this, the Roaring 20s. And in fact, this is Wuhan in August of last year after people were released from lockdown. They threw a pool party. A massive concert was staged in this big pool area. Look at them. People are just packed in and there's not a mask in sight. So this highlights the fact that people are resilient. People bounce back. People will return to normal. Although you might have trouble imagining it right now, it will happen. One question I've been asked is, will we see psychological remnants of COVID-19? Will it leave some kind of psychological scar? Some people, yeah, but for most, I think no. Think back to the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. Everyone in Western countries was wearing masks. That Roaring 20s photograph, no one is wearing a mask. This was just a year later after the pandemic had ended. So I expect that in 2022, if this pandemic ends this year, hardly anyone is going to be wearing a mask. We don't forget about doing that. There could be virus mutations, and often these viruses mutate into milder versions because the only way virus survives is by not killing off its hosts. And one theory about the 1889 Russian flu pandemic, one theory is that it was a coronavirus that mutated into one of the coronaviruses that now cause the common cold. I think there are about 4 of those coronaviruses around. And so this could happen with COVID-19, although currently we're seeing mutations of a different kind. We know from natural disasters that most people are resilient. However, that said, from the natural disaster research, about 15% of people develop chronic problems. And we know that from that and from SARS. So PTSD or obsessive compulsive disorder with contamination obsessions and cleaning compulsions could arise or worsen during COVID-19. However, like I said, most people are resilient, and there's a phenomenon called post-traumatic growth. And that is post-traumatic growth is where you don't just return to baseline or return to normal after a traumatic event. You actually grow as a human being. It's growth through adversity. We've started doing some research on this. And we asked people, we said to them, well, you know, this pandemic has been severe and many people have died or got very sick, but some people are reporting that there's some positive personal changes or silver linings. Have you experienced any of these things? And we asked people to complete a questionnaire. And we found that 45% of people said, yeah, it's been tough, but there have been some positive personal changes due to COVID-19. For example, some people say they developed a better appreciation for friends and family, a greater compassion for others, or feeling more resilient, or a deepening of spiritual beliefs, and so forth. I remember the first time I went to a restaurant after the lockdown was lifted last year, and wow, that was great. I savored that moment. So yeah, people are saying they're reporting a greater appreciation for the little things in life. Now, there are two issues that we want to look at in this. Is this growth enduring? You know, people saying they're feeling more resilient. Is that going to be a long-lasting increase in stress resiliency, or a long-lasting increase in appreciation for friends and family, or will it be short-lived? I'm hoping it will be long-lasting. The other thing we want to look at is whether there are cases of true post-traumatic growth or illusory post-traumatic growth. And we've been following up people longitudinally, and we're finding that some of these people who claim they're more resilient to stress have actually become more and more depressed and anxious over time. So it looks like in those cases, it's illusory growth. It's not true post-traumatic growth. They're trying to tell themselves that they're doing better, but they're really not. In other cases, we're finding it looks like there are some people who genuinely are improving or growing as human beings as a result of this pandemic. So there might be some silver linings out of all this. I want to conclude, when I started writing my book on the psychology of pandemics, one thing I didn't mention, I first submitted the draft of the book in early 2019 to my publisher who'd been publishing my books, and he rejected it. He said, oh, it's an interesting idea. No one's going to want to read it though. And I felt really deflated. I said, but it's really important. Psychology is hugely important in pandemics. He didn't think so. So I submitted it to another publisher, and of course it was published in April. But that gets to the thing that's important. Back then, I would be talking to people trying to tell them that psychology is hugely important in pandemics, and no one would believe me. People thought it was a pandemic was just some bug that goes viral, but it's not true. As we've seen, psychology is hugely important. And what we need is more psychology in the future management of pandemics. We need to be prepared for the next pandemic. We need to have expert groups ready to set up internet-based treatment resources or government advisory groups. I'm on the Canadian federal government's advisory group on COVID-19, and we advise the Deputy Prime Minister. But there's about 40 of us in that group, and I am the only psychologist. There are all other disease experts and so forth. I think we need more psychology. We need psychology around the messaging that health authorities and political leaders give out to people, dealing with things like message fatigue, trying to find ways of combating pandemic fatigue. So we need more psychology. So with that, I'll finish there, and thank you very much.
Stephen, thank you so much. Before I ask people to raise questions, allow me to share two ideas very quickly. First, I think it was very interesting to see that so many of our experiences were already, lived by other people, before, this is something that brings us some kind of, this is normal, all right, our anxiety, conspiracy theories, all of that were lived before. And I think it's really interesting to have that mindset. Another small note, I think it's really interesting that I understood a kind of a hope message in your presentation. When you talk about the post-pandemic world, of course, we are going to have so many problems, but at the same time, we are going to be able to move forward and eventually with some other resources. And I think that's very important too. I would have so many questions to raise, but I wonder if some other people, yes, we have here Tatiana Santos. Tatiana Santos have one question to make, I don't know. Yes, go ahead, please.
Hi,
Thank you.
hello everybody. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm doing my PhD in history, specifically in history of religion. And we know that religious structures have a huge role in helping or working against this kind of phenomena. For instance, from 1981 to 1989, during the Reagan administration, we had the AIDS gate, and AIDS was seen as God's punishment, for instance. From your personal experience, do you have any insights on how religious structures are dealing with these pandemics?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Historically, religiosity increases during pandemics, and there's data now showing that this is happening during COVID-19 as well. And that it's in past pandemics, the closing of churches has always been controversial. For example, during the Spanish flu pandemic, there was a lot of protests. In fact, some clergy violated the social distancing guideline and were having masses during the churches, and they were arguing that the church is essential for boosting morale, and bringing people together, and for other sorts of things. And that is true, but unfortunately, church services are also a source of super spreading events. Now, in the town of Zamora in Spain, during the Spanish flu, there was a very charismatic bishop there. And he said, well, you health authorities aren't doing much to control this pandemic, so we need to pray to Saint Rocco, the patron saint of plagues. So he organized what was called let me think of the word, a novella, which is 9 days of masses in a row, where they would go in, people would crowd into the cathedral, they would kiss the relics, and as a result, Zamora had the highest rate of deaths of any city in Europe. It was a massive super spreading event. And we're seeing the same now during COVID-19, where there are super spreading events where people are attending church services. You know, you may think you're okay being 6 feet apart, but if you're singing in church, you need to be more than 6 feet apart. And so, yes, church services are very important for morale and for other reasons, but they need to be done really carefully because of the potential for super spreading events.
Thank you, Stephen. Anyone more for a question? Stephen, you talked about risk communication, which I think it's a very important aspect to deal with pandemics. I've been a little bit, to be honest, critical about the way some politics have been dealing with the risk communication. At the same time, I think it's a very difficult task. You said it's, you have been the experience of being advising the government. What can you tell us about that? What is your perspective about the way, in general, we are been dealing with this risk communication?
What we need to do is the messages that are crafted, they need to be pilot tested for a start.
Yeah.
Back in, I think it was back in April, health authorities were giving the message, because we're going into lockdowns, telling people, oh, you better stock up with a 2-week supply. And that seemed like an innocuous sort of message, but it precipitated panic buying. It caused people to rush to the stores and panic. So that message had some very serious effects. So we need to pilot test these messages to check that they don't have unintended consequences. We need to realize that messages can grow stale, that people start to tune out a message if they hear it again and again and again. We need to be careful of that. We also need to realize that no one message will get to everyone in the community. We need to target particular messages. During the summer in Canada and other places, there were complaints that young people were going out and having parties and creating super spreading events. And the government was frustrated, but they didn't think about the sort of messaging that they should be should be using. They were starting to shame them, referring to these people as COVID-idiots, and that didn't work. What they should have done is said, okay, we need to get some grassroots communication. We need to get, let's say, public health announcements written or created or crafted by young people for young people. That kind of messaging could have been more effective. Getting creative and getting people in the community more involved in creating the sorts of messages.
Okay, thanks. So it's really hard work, right?
Yes, yes.
Different message for different groups. Okay. You talked about a very interesting concept, post-traumatic growth. Do you think it's something that it's useful? It's a very important concept for us to use in the near future.
I think it is. It's been around for a long time, and there's been some research on it. There's still that debate as to whether it's true growth or false growth, which is an issue to investigate. But I think that for some people, they do come through traumatic events as stronger human beings. But I think the public needs to hear about this as well, as a way of getting people to think about how they might have changed or how they might change themselves during this pandemic for the better. So instead of an exclusive focus on depression or misery or anxiety, getting people to think about whether they have become better as human beings. And that's a positive message that can help people get through this pandemic.
Right, thanks. I think we have a question from Nathaniel Matos.
Hello, thank you for everything you are talking to us. I think it will help us a lot here in Portugal. My question, it is about a view, a social psychologist view that how can we fix polarization of society? It's a risk also. I think it is a phase of this kind of things.
It is. It is a problem at the best of times, and I guess pandemics bring out these sorts of extremes. Extremes of denying the pandemic or extremes of becoming highly anxious. That I'm not aware of any simple or straightforward solution to dealing with the problem of polarization, and I think that's something that social psychologists certainly could be looking at, and that would be very beneficial to society. But I think one thing that is important is to have a political leader who doesn't polarize people. And again, getting back to Donald Trump, him referring to the coronavirus as a Chinese virus, that polarizes people. Beyond that, I'm not sure what we can do to stop people polarizing. And maybe part of it is built into our genome, because human beings are tribalistic in nature. We just the way we think about it is an us versus them, whether it be football teams or political parties or nationalities. It seems that we've evolved to be tribalistic. And so I'm not sure exactly how we would get about changing that tendency to polarize.
Can I say something? I have read 3 books about conspiracy theories, trying to search for some information. I'm a clinical psychologist and psychotherapist, and I was searching for some information about psychological issues around conspiracy theories. And then I found that they study these things. Many times they put clinical psychology in one side. And it was my way of thinking these things. It was thinking, perhaps many people have some problems with paranoid things, with reality, and things around that. And another vulnerability problems. But then I see another face of the phenomenon, like social phenomenon. and that is growing, and that is very present this moment, because it's a big movement that try to break down the social equation, yes. And then I begin to think that we need others, many things, but we also need to make the point, to go to the main point. And I don't know how to deal with this, but we need some things that help us to don't stay in the point that we can begin to say one to the others that we are stupid and things like this that can grow that movement. I don't know. And thank you very much.
Yeah, I agree with you. And the conspiracy theories are way more complicated than people realize. And I agree that we do need to look into different subspecialties of psychology and also history as well to better understand these conspiracy theories. And this is how the conspiracy theorists during COVID-19 might be a little different from the ones of the past, because conspiracy theories have become so prominent during COVID-19.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, thank you for your question. I think we have another person raising the hand. Angela Martins, please go ahead. Angela?
Yeah, I'm not unmute. Thank you very much for the presentation. And well, I'm working for the HR department, and I lead with different companies regarding how to deal with employees, regarding just to assuming this role to help employees to deal with remote working, the health impact that the pandemic has. So my question regarding this is if you have some good examples of best practice that companies deal with that, getting some results in this process. Thank you.
That's a really good question, a good point. I haven't come across any best practice guidelines, though there are no doubt guidelines out there. And I guess they would vary to some extent, depending on the nature of the job. But I would think that good practice guidelines would involve things like setting a structure in your day, taking time out for physical activity or other sorts of stress management. During lockdown, people have often commented that it's like they're in a fog, that they're having trouble remembering what they did. And I think that's partly because of the lack of structure. And one of the risks of working at home is that lack of structure, where one day is exactly the same as the day before. There's no, oh, it's Friday evening, I'm going out with my friends. There's none of those landmarks in the day. And then there also are the stresses of trying to homeschool young children or look after young children while you're also trying to work from home. I'm not sure about the solution to that, but nonetheless, I think the stress management and structure will be two important things in best practices to help people work from home. And I guess that raises the question of socializing too. Many people associate Zoom with going to work. And so that makes it harder for people to enjoy social interactions via Zoom, because it's a tool that you associate with working. And I guess that can make that a little more difficult or challenging to socialize with other people.
Thank you, Stephen. One more question, Tatiana Santos. Go ahead, please.
Sorry. I work a lot with the importance of rituals, and you talked about the rituals previously. So I was thinking, since now we don't have the daily rituals like we used to, like the marriages, the funerals and so on, those rituals are of extreme importance in social roles and transitional stages of life. What do you think we can do now that we are deprived of those rituals? Can we replace them, or will the virtual fill that gap in any way?
Yeah, my concern is the longer this drags out and the more people are prevented from engaging in rituals, the more they will rebel, and there will be protests. In fact, we've seen this already where people are having large weddings or attending funerals despite the government lockdown guidelines. They're just violating it and going to those events. And of course, that increases the risk for super spreading. So this is very challenging. And I think that governments have underestimated how important these rituals are to people. And so I think more needs to be done to find ways of making these things safer. Can you attend a funeral service or a wedding where there are large groups of people? Can you do it in a way that is safe? I think governments need to be creative about that and getting messages out to people. But it is challenging. Going to a funeral via Skype or Zoom just doesn't really feel real, does it?
Yeah. Thank you, Stephen. Laura Nunes. Go ahead, please. Laura Nunes.
Okay. Hello. Thank you for your presentation. It's very interesting seeing the whole point of view of the pandemic by a colleague. I work in a hospital with a pediatrical population. And when this pandemic started, we opened lots of ways of connecting to the psychology department, especially lines for health professionals. But the phone never rings. So people are not professionals that are working in the front line. They are not calling. They are not asking for psychology help, and they are saying that they need to be active now. They need to not think a lot about what's happening to them personally, and it's and I don't know if it makes sense. I wanted to ask your opinion about it. What can we do to help these professionals that are in closer contact to the infections, the deaths, and they are in a very critical point of strategical to lead with the pandemic? What can we do to help them? Should we stay still and depend on their resilience, or any other kind of movements?
It's a really good question. I guess the needs of healthcare workers can change over time. If you've got healthcare workers that are currently working long hours, 60 hours a week, for example, who are emotionally exhausted, for them, getting out, getting some exercise and getting some sleep might be the thing that they want most of all at this point. But that could change over time. I think it's important for us to be able to assess the needs of healthcare workers and then to adapt our interventions or strategies based on the needs and being able to determine whether those needs shift. And I know colleagues who run stress management groups for doctors and nurses, psychologists, and they go into clinics and do that sort of thing. And that seems to have been something that's been well received. For other people, they're running workshops on stress management, which seems to be well received for healthcare workers. But in other cases, it's been more of a peer support program where doctors will help other doctors. And that's based on the idea, they understand the specifics of the situation. And we can help there in an advisory capacity. But I guess one thing is raising people's awareness of the availability of psychology and how we could, it need not be in a therapy format or a group therapy format. It could be in any kind of a situation. It could even be a lunchtime workshop kind of format that could be helping. So there's that issue. And of course, many healthcare workers will say, well, what they really need are more resources. They need more nurses, more doctors, more beds, more ventilators. I'm reminded there was a tsunami in Southeast Asia in the was it early 2000s, and the Red Cross issued a statement. They said, please, all the counselors and psychologists stay home. We don't need any more psychologists. What we need is clean running water and shelters and food and infrastructure. So that gets to the issue of timing. I would suggest, raising the awareness of healthcare workers that we have some things we can offer, and then seeing when the timing would be right to implement those strategies.
Thank you, Stephen. We have one more question from Filipa Feliciano. Go ahead, please. Filipa?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so we were talking about rituals like marriages and funerals, and my mind was stuck in funerals. I guess grief is something necessary in human life, and I guess it's like a transition. But if we don't have that moment, how can we fill that gap in our lives? And how can we help people dealing with that? Thank you.
It's a good point. I guess, we can help people come together and grieve digitally. It's not the same as being face to face, but probably that's the best we could do at the moment, given social distancing and so forth, because we don't want to create super spreading events. But I guess grief is a process, isn't it? A protracted process. We might not be able to do much now because we're all in lockdown or so forth, but there will be a time when people will be able to return to those face-to-face rituals. You will be able to hug people and so forth. But I guess letting people know that, yeah, you might have trouble grieving right now, but there will come a time where you will be able to get back to the way things were. Because, if you've lost a loved one, it's not, as you know, it's not simply grieving at the funeral and you're done. It could last for years, if not longer.
Thanks, Stephen. One more question. Anke Elena, please.
Yeah, hi. My name is Anka. It was a great presentation. Thank you so much. You were on point. What I want to know actually from your perspective is what you think, what kind of mistakes the authorities did. I mean, if, I don't know, in 100, 200 years, another pandemic will come, what we learn from this? Maybe we can apply some strategies or what we can do in the future, what you'll tell to the people in 100 years, 200, what you can advise them to do better than this time. Thank you.
I'm thinking that the next pandemic won't be in 100 years. I was thinking more like 5 years, unfortunately, because with climate change, there's going to be an increase in outbreaks of infectious diseases in various places, including an increase in tropical diseases, quite possibly. But the question, which is a really good one, is how can we prepare for the next pandemic? I think we need to understand how human beings think. In the US, they had a pandemic preparedness program that they dismantled in 2019 before COVID-19 came, thinking, oh, we don't need this. The Spanish flu has been described as a forgotten pandemic. When that pandemic ended, people forgot about it. They forgot the lessons they learned. They stopped wearing masks, and they just went on with their daily lives and started focusing on things rather than learning the lessons. New Year's Eve 2020, there were lots of media reports of people saying they wanted to forget 2020 and just move on. So I can understand that, but we've done this in the past. We've been short-sighted. We've forgotten the lessons we've learned from past pandemics, and now we're paying for it. So for this next pandemic, we really need to learn the lessons of COVID-19. We need to remind ourselves that, yeah, as human beings, we have had this tendency to be short-sighted. We focus on the problems immediately in front of us and forget about the other ones. We haven't been very good at long-range planning. And maybe we do need to do this now. We've already set up, people are setting up internet resources and phone apps for delivering therapy. remotely. We need to continue with those to keep them and build them up even more, not only for the next pandemic, but as a way of reaching people in rural places and other sorts of situations. We need to remember the things that we did well in this pandemic. The naming of the virus was good. Calling it COVID-19 is great. It has a kind of serious name, but it doesn't refer to any people, places, or things. That was great. We failed to anticipate problems that routinely occur. So for the next pandemic, we need to be proactive. Authorities need to realize that they will see panic buying. They will see a rise of racism and discrimination, and they need to take steps proactively to address those sorts of problems. So remembering the past, not forgetting it, keeping those infrastructures in place and anticipating, being proactive instead of waiting for problems to explode in our faces, I think are important for the next pandemic.
Thanks, Stephen. Our colleague Carlos Lopes would like to make you a question, but he's having some problems with his micro. His question is, how can health literacy, articulated with psychological intervention, provide a more effective response to the pandemic?
Health literacy and also media literacy are hugely important because the people who buy into misinformation tend to have a lower media literacy, including people who believe in theories. Part of the challenge is the sheer volume of information out there and the rise of anti-science attitudes as well. I think to deal with the problem of health literacy, it starts in childhood at schools. Children need to get the message that science is important and to have that. And of course, then there are, I guess, strategies for helping people identify the best sources for getting their information. But again, the infodemic, the sheer amount has made it difficult. The other problem is conspiracy theorists and trolls have become increasingly sophisticated in producing fake news. There's a video, so-called documentary on the internet called the Plandemic. I don't recommend watching it. It's a waste of time. It presents all of these crazy conspiracy theories. The person being interviewed is a discredited virologist, and she was claiming that you got COVID from wearing a face mask. Now, it's very slick. It looks just like a professional BBC documentary. And so if you didn't know about the area, you could get easily drawn into it and believe it. And the way in which that was dealt with is that it was banned from YouTube and Facebook and the social media sites. So I think that's the quick fix for health literacy, and this is what's been happening now. Facebook groups that are putting out misinformation on vaccine, they're finding themselves being banned from Facebook. And that's a very crude solution, but it does seem to work in reducing the amount of fake news out there. So that doesn't improve people's health literacy, but it reduces their exposure to fake news, which is somewhat helpful.
Right, thanks. Stephen, you talked about something that I don't think we are talking too much here in Portugal, which is about the long COVID-19. Do you have some data on that? I mean, I think we need to be prepared to have people that is going to have some long COVID, even in its psychological impacts. Do you have some perspective on that?
Yeah, I haven't been doing data research on that personally, but a lot of colleagues of mine have been. It's very difficult to nail it down. There seems to be all kinds of versions of people who recovered from their infection, and they could have any of a number of health sorts of problems or psychological problems, memory problems, recurrent headaches, chronic fatigue. And it's probably not a single syndrome. There's probably multiple sorts of syndromes or multiple sorts of causes. And unfortunately, it's been the topic of discrimination. People are saying, oh, it's all in your head. And so there are people who are suffering from post-COVID chronic fatigue are being disbelieved and so forth, which that makes the problem worse. I think what is needed at this point is a better understanding of what it is or what are the causes of it, and then we can be in a better position to treat it.
So there are many similarities, right, about previous pandemics, but you talked also about the differences. And I would say maybe one of the biggest challenges is about the social media. I don't know if you agree. I mean, how can you how can you cope? And going back to the problem of risk communication, what you can do regarding this big challenge of, I guess our world is really different from the Spanish flu now. And regarding the media, what is the best strategies to deal with that in your perspective?
I think one good strategy is for people to remember that the news they get from social media is distorted. It's because people are circulating or sharing stories that are sensational in some fashion. So when you get your news on COVID-19, get it from a reliable, reputable news service. Don't get your news from social media. So that would be one thing. And be careful how you use social media. Social media can be a great social support for people, and that's really good. But don't get your news from it, and be careful about don't spend too much time looking at sensational COVID-related stuff on social media. And I know in our research, the people who do that it makes them more anxious. They might start checking news stories to reassure themselves, and before you know it, they've spent hours looking at very dramatic images, and then they're having nightmares about it and so forth. So they need to limit their dose of social media and to use it for connecting with people, but not for getting information about COVID-19.
So one of the differences is that our information now tends to be more abstract. Is that so? Do you think that the way?
Yeah, that's part of it. It's more abstract. We're not seeing corpses in the street, but it's also the amount of information and the speed with which it travels around the world. So people can be getting anxious about getting infected, even though there might be no cases of infection in their communities. That it makes it a bit different from past pandemics, but not completely different. If you go back to the 1889 Russian flu pandemic, that was the first pandemic in the era of the telegraph and the widespread distribution of newspapers. So there are reports of people. At one point, there was an article in The Lancet in 1889 where the author complained that the pandemic was being spread by telegraph. And what he meant by that was people were getting anxious because they were reading news stories. You know, you might be sitting in London reading a news story about St. Petersburg in Russia the day before, and you're reading about all of these deaths, and that was making people anxious. So the media was having an impact even back then, but not to the extent that it's having an impact today. Today, of course, the impact is massive.
Thanks. Stephen, do you have time for one more question? We have Catarina Almeida. Last question. Thank you. Catarina, go ahead. Catarina?
Hello, and thanks for sharing your expertise. This process already has over 1 year. And my question is, how do you think all of this balance between the individual liberty and the social responsibility is going to have an impact on the younger generations and their learning how to be human in the future?
That's an interesting question. I really don't know the answer, because from previous pandemics, it's been difficult to assess the impact on young children or whether the impact depends on a critical developmental period. So I'm not sure. It's a really interesting and really important question that deserves to be researched, but I really don't know the answer to that question.
Thanks, Stephen. Can you tell people, to finish our conversation, how they can buy your book if they want to buy your book, where they can find it? I don't know if in Amazon, but people they are also asking if they can buy from the publisher, maybe without being through the Amazon. Do you have some clues on that, please?
Yeah, if you go to the publisher's website, Cambridge Scholars Publishing, you can get it directly from the publisher. It's also available on Kindle too. So that would be the cheapest way, the quickest way of getting it from Kindle. You can just download that from Amazon. But if you want a hard copy, you go to Cambridge Scholars Publishing.
Okay, thank you so much. And if you want to be updated with your research, we go to the website that you mentioned in the end of your presentation, right?
Yes, we've been posting our research papers on there and other sorts of resources too.
Right, right. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you so much for being with us. I hope we can join, say, in a year maybe for another conversation if we have time, and see how the world is going to be in that time, hopefully much better than today. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thanks very much, Daniel. And thank you, everyone, for your really good questions and comments. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. See you
Thanks
soon.
again.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. See you soon. Take